The strangest part of that night was not the prison break. It was the locked gate. Inside the house, believers were praying for Peter to be delivered. Their voices were low. Their fear was real. Herod had already taken one apostle's life, and Peter might be next. But outside that same house, the answer to their prayer was already standing in the dark. Peter was free. He was alive. And he was knocking. Only one person heard him first, a servant girl named Rhoda. She ran back with the news everyone had begged God to make true. But when she spoke, the room did not believe her. Before the night ended, they would understand something holy and painful. Sometimes God's answer is not delayed because heaven is silent. Sometimes the answer is already at the door, waiting for fear, pride, and disbelief to move out of the way. The strangest thing about that night was not the locked gate. It was the sound behind it. Inside the house, believers were praying for Peter to be freed. Outside the house, though they did not yet know it, Peter was already free. The miracle had crossed prison walls, slipped past guards, and reached the street. But it still could not enter the room. It had to knock. And somewhere near that threshold stood a servant girl named Rhoda, close enough to hear what others were too afraid to believe that night. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Acts 12 gives us the shape of the night, though not every detail of the room. It tells us that Peter had been arrested, that the church was praying earnestly, and that many had gathered in the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark. It was not a casual meeting. It was not a quiet Bible study after a peaceful day. It was a room filled with people who knew danger had come close. James had already been killed. Peter was in prison. Herod's power was not a distant rumor. It had entered their lives, taken one of their own, and now threatened another. So the gate was locked for a reason. That lock was not just wood and metal. It was grief. It was caution. It was memory. It was the fear of footsteps in the street, the fear of soldiers, the fear that one more knock might mean one more arrest. Inside, the believers prayed. Their prayers were real. Their fear was real too. And that is what makes the story so human. They were not heartless people. They were not villains in a sacred drama. They were wounded believers trying to keep faith alive while death stood close enough to be remembered by name. Yet before the night ended, they would discover something they did not expect. Sometimes God answers before the heart is ready to recognize the answer. Sometimes the miracle arrives while the room is still afraid. And sometimes the person closest to the door is the one God allows to hear grace first. Her name was Rhoda. Scripture does not give us a long biography. It does not tell us her age, her family story, or how long she had served in that house. It simply names her as a servant girl. That small detail matters. She was not one of the leading voices in the room. She was not the person others looked to for direction. She was not the one expected to interpret the moment, steady the fearful, or decide what should be done next. But she was there. That is important. Rhoda was close enough to the prayers to hear them, close enough to the entrance to hear the knock, close enough to the miracle to recognize it before anyone else in the gathered community did. The sacred wound of this story begins there. She was near enough to serve the prayer, but not high enough to be trusted with the answer. Imagine the room carefully, but reverently. We should not pretend to know every detail. Still, we can understand the human shape of it. In a crowded house at night, some people would naturally gather closer to the center. Others would stand near walls, doorways, and thresholds. Some voices would carry weight. Others would move quietly, helping the gathering continue. Rhoda may have carried water. She may have adjusted a lamp. She may have moved through the shadows with practiced quietness, careful not to interrupt the prayers of those considered more important. Perhaps someone took a cup from her hand without looking fully into her face. Perhaps someone gently motioned for her to step aside so an older believer could sit closer. These are imagined gestures, but the wound they represent is ancient and painfully believable. Not every humiliation is loud. Some humiliation is social. Some is domestic. Some is spiritual. Some happens when a person is useful but unseen, present but underestimated, allowed to work but not expected to witness. Rhoda belonged to the house, but not fully to the authority of the room. And yet, God's answer would not first touch the most honored seat. It would not first arrive through the strongest speaker. It would not first be recognized by the most respected person present. It would come to the threshold, It would come near the one who had been positioned at the edge. That is one of the quiet mysteries of this story. The very place that made Rhoda easy to overlook also placed her where she could hear what others missed. Near the door, near the danger, near the answer. Then came the knock. It may not have been loud. It did not need to be. In a frightened house, even a small sound can cross the room like a warning. Someone stopped praying. Someone lifted their head. A candle trembled. The night outside seemed suddenly nearer. A knock at that hour could mean many things. It could mean a neighbor in trouble. It could mean a messenger. It could mean danger. It could mean soldiers had found them, but Rhoda was near enough to respond. Acts tells us that she went to answer the door at the gate. We should notice that. She did not ignore the sound. She did not freeze in the center of the room. Her work, her position, and perhaps her habit of serving brought her toward the threshold. On the other side stood Peter. He had been sleeping between soldiers, bound with chains. According to Acts, an angel of the Lord had come to him. Light had shone in the prison, chains had fallen, and Peter had been let out. The details belong to Scripture, and they should be treated with reverence, not sensationalism. The point is not spectacle. The point is deliverance. God had acted. Peter had passed through what should have held him. The iron gate of the prison had opened. The street had received him. And now, after all that, he stood outside the house where believers were praying for him. But this gate remained closed. Rhoda came close enough to hear his voice. She recognized it. That moment must have been almost too much for the human heart to hold. The name they had been praying over was no longer only a name in danger. The man himself was at the gate. The prayer had not vanished into the night. It had returned with a voice. Peter was alive. Peter was free. Peter was outside. Acts tells us that Rhoda was so overjoyed she did not open the gate. Instead, she ran back inside to announce that Peter was standing there. This detail is beautifully human. It should not be treated as foolishness. Joy sometimes moves faster than the hands. Shock can outrun practical sense. She had gone to answer a knock and found the impossible speaking her name from the other side. So she ran. The latch remained untouched. Peter remained outside, and Rhoda carried the news into the room like a flame. She had heard the answer. She had recognized the voice. She had become, inside that praying house, the first witness that their prayer had already been answered. All she needed now was for the room to believe her. Rhoda came back breathless. The room had been praying for Peter. She told them Peter was at the gate, and they did not believe her. This is where the story becomes more than a miracle account. It becomes a mirror. Depending on the translation, Acts records their response with painful bluntness. "You are out of your mind." They thought she was mistaken. They thought excitement, fear, or confusion had overcome her. When she kept insisting, they reached for another explanation. "It is his angel. We should be careful here. This is not a moment to mock them." Their fear had a history. Their grief had a name. They knew what Herod had done. They knew what could happen next. Their minds were trying to make sense of news too good to trust. But fear can still wound people. Even sincere believers can become slow to recognize mercy. Rhoda was not offering an opinion. She was not interrupting with gossip. She was not seeking attention. She was telling them what she had heard with her own ears. Peter was at the gate. Yet the room found it easier to question her than to open the door. This is the sacred wound at the center of the story. They did not merely doubt that Peter was free. They doubted that Rhoda could be the one through whom God announced it. Her testimony became small in their ears because her place in the room was small. She was trusted to serve, but not trusted to testify. And that wound still speaks. Many people know what it feels like to carry something true and be dismissed, because their voice comes from the edge of the room. A child tries to tell the truth and is told to calm down. A worker sees what others miss and is ignored because of their title. A quiet believer senses grace moving and is dismissed because they do not have status. A faithful person brings a word of hope, but it sounds too unlikely coming from them. Scripture does not tell us exactly what Rhoda felt. We should not pretend to know, but the scene itself carries the ache. Her joy must have met a wall. The answer was at the gate, but her words could not get through the room. Perhaps she pointed back toward the entrance. Perhaps she repeated herself. Perhaps her voice rose, not in rebellion, but in urgency. Peter was outside. He should not be left there. The night was dangerous. The miracle was exposed. But still they argued. Still they explained. Still the gate remained closed. And then the sound came again. Peter kept knocking. The miracle had escaped prison, but it had not yet entered the prayer room. That repeated knocking is one of the most haunting sounds in the story. Peter was free, but waiting. The believers were praying, but doubting. Rhoda was right, but dismissed. And the answer to their prayer stood on the wrong side of a locked gate. This is the point of no return. The scene could no longer remain only spiritual. It had become visible. Someone would have to move. Someone would have to decide whether the servant girl's witness was worth testing. Someone would have to open what fear had kept closed. The gate now meant more than safety. It had become a line between prayer and recognition. Inside the house, they had asked God to act. Outside the house, God's action was still knocking. There is a painful mercy in that delay. God did not waste it. We should not say carelessly that God caused every moment of waiting simply to shame them. That would be too harsh and too certain. But we can say this. Before the night ended, the waiting revealed something. It revealed their fear. It revealed their assumptions. It revealed how hard it can be to receive an answer when it comes through a person we did not expect. And it revealed Rhoda's quiet courage. She kept insisting. That matters. It would have been easy for her to shrink back. She had been corrected. Her report had been dismissed. People older and more respected than she was had offered other explanations. The room had made it clear that her certainty did not carry much weight. But the knocking continued, and so did her witness. She could not free Peter from prison. God had already done that. She could not force the room to believe. No servant can make the powerful humble by volume alone, but she could keep telling the truth. Peter is at the gate. We are not told whether Rhoda felt hurt in that moment, but anyone who has ever been disbelieved while telling the truth can understand the loneliness of it. The deepest wound is not always that people reject your information. Sometimes the deeper wound is that they reject your capacity to know what you know, as if truth becomes less true when it passes through your mouth, as if grace becomes less likely when you are the one who heard it first. The room may have thought it was protecting itself from false hope, but in that moment, its caution nearly became another kind of captivity. Peter had left the prison, but the house still had to be delivered from fear. The believers had prayed for an open door, but first, something inside them had to open. At last, the knocking could no longer be ignored. The repeated sound pressed against every explanation. It pressed against disbelief. It pressed against embarrassment. It pressed against the room's assumption that Rhoda could not possibly be right. Someone moved toward the gate. Perhaps the room fell silent. Perhaps Rhoda stood still, waiting for the truth to become visible. The latch was reached. The door was opened, and the night changed. Peter stood there, alive, free, real. The room that had prayed for him now had to face the answer it almost left outside. Acts tells us they were amazed when they opened the door and saw him. That amazement carried many things at once. Relief, joy, shock, and perhaps a quiet shame. Not the shame of being hated by God, but the humbling realization that mercy had been nearer than they believed. Rhoda had not imagined the voice. She had not misunderstood the knock. She had not been carried away by childish excitement. She had heard correctly. The servant girl at the threshold had become the witness of answered prayer. This was not revenge. There is no need to imagine Rhoda standing over the room in triumph. That would make the story smaller. Sacred restoration is deeper than winning an argument. Justice came quietly, not as humiliation, but as recognition. The opened gate did more than prove Rhoda right. It revealed the mercy of God, who answers even while his people are still learning how to receive. It showed that sincere prayer and trembling faith can live in the same room. It showed that fear does not cancel grace. And it showed that God is free to let his answer be heard first by the person everyone else has trained themselves to overlook. Peter, the candlelight must have fallen across his face, his hands, perhaps the marks of the night he had just survived. Acts says he motioned for them to be quiet and explained how the Lord had brought him out of prison. That is where the miracle belongs, not in human cleverness, not in social status, not in the strength of the prayer meeting, but in the Lord's deliverance. Still, Scripture preserves Rhoda's name. That is not a small thing. Many servants in history remain unnamed. Many quiet witnesses disappear behind the stories of leaders, apostles, rulers, and martyrs. But here, in this brief and luminous scene, her name remains. Rhoda, the girl who went to the gate, the girl who recognized the voice, the girl who ran with joy, the girl no one believed at first, the girl whose witness was confirmed before the night ended. The payoff of this story is not merely that Peter came home. It is also that Rhoda's voice, once dismissed, was restored by reality itself. The open gate gave back what the room had taken from her: dignity, credibility, belonging, and sacred memory. And maybe that is why this story still matters. Because the world is full of locked rooms. Some are locked by fear, some by grief, some by disappointment, some by religious habit, some by the quiet belief that God's answer must come through the right kind of person, with the right kind of title, in the right kind of way. But Acts 12 asks a tender and uncomfortable question. What if the answer is already at the gate? What if grace has been knocking longer than we realized? What if the person we ignored was the one God allowed to hear it first? This story does not ask us to despise the praying room. It asks us to examine the doors we keep locked. It does not tell us to mock frightened believers. It reminds us that fear can enter even sacred places, and that God's mercy is patient enough to keep knocking. Before that night ended, they understood. God had not wasted the waiting. The delay at the gate had revealed the room's fear, Rhoda's faithfulness, Peter's deliverance, and the strange kindness of a God who can restore more than one prisoner in the same story. Peter had been freed from chains. The room had been freed from disbelief, and Rhoda had been freed from invisibility. The final image is simple. A gate stands open in the night. Peter has stepped into the light. The room is stunned into worship, and near the threshold stands Rhoda, no longer merely the servant girl near the door, but the witness who heard the miracle knocking before anyone else believed it. The story of Rhoda in Acts 12 is not only about Peter escaping prison, it is also about a room full of sincere believers learning how difficult it can be to recognize answered prayer when it arrives in an unexpected form. That is what makes this story so human. The people in Mary's house were not evil. They were not faithless in a simple way. They were afraid. They had already seen violence. They knew Peter's life was in danger. Their prayers were real, but so was their fear. And then God answered. But the first person to recognize the answer was not the strongest voice in the room. It was Rhoda, a servant girl near the gate. She was close enough to hear the knock, close enough to recognize Peter's voice, and brave enough to carry the news back inside. Yet her testimony was dismissed. This is where the story becomes a mirror. Many people know what it feels like to carry something true and not be believed. Many know what it means to be useful but unseen, present but underestimated, faithful but overlooked. The message is not that the praying community should be mocked. The message is that all of us can become blind when fear controls what we are willing to believe. God's mercy in this story is gentle but powerful. He does not simply free Peter from prison. He also exposes the locked places inside the room. He restores Rhoda's voice. He humbles the believers. He turns waiting into revelation. Sometimes the delay is not empty. Sometimes the miracle is already knocking. And sometimes God allows the overlooked person to hear it first. If this story touched something in you, take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who has been waiting, praying, or feeling unseen. And I want to ask you something personal. Have you ever felt like Rhoda, carrying the truth, carrying hope, carrying a message, but feeling like your voice did not matter because of where you stood in the room? Or have you ever been on the other side praying for God to answer, but almost missing the answer because it came through someone you did not expect? Tell us in the comments. Your story may encourage someone else who is standing near their own locked gate tonight. And if you want more sacred stories from Scripture, early Christian memory, forgotten witnesses, and powerful moments of faith, make sure you subscribe to Channel Name. In the next video, we will step into another sacred moment where God's mercy moved quietly, unexpectedly, and through someone the world almost overlooked. Until then, remember this. The answer may be closer than you think. Sometimes, it is already knocking.